Alright, this is our cell cycle video. This is our first video in Unit 8. So you will need to take the notes down in your journal immediately following your Unit 8 checklist that you should have glued in. And make sure you're writing everything on the screen and highlighting, circling things as I do so as well. Make sure you stop and pause, rewind, and rewatch any parts that you need to go back and review. So here we go. Just to recap, remember cells are the basic unit of life. So every living thing is made up of cells. And so just like you and me, as they get older, they grow bigger. So as a cell gets big, grows up and it gets bigger, eventually this is going to trigger the cell to divide and become two cells. And this is going to take us through a process called mitosis and cytokinesis, which is how cells divide, which is what we'll talk about in the next video. So first, let's go through the stages of the cell cycle before we go and talk about cell division. The first phase of the cell cycle is called the G1 phase, and the G1 phase simply stands for growth 1 phase. Okay, this is the first event in the life of a cell cycle. So if we look at this diagram that I have here, this picture, you can see that it's a cycle, so it's in a circle, and the G1 phase takes up about a quarter of the cell's life. Okay, so a cell spends a good chunk of its life in the G1 phase at the very beginning. So right after a cell is created, it spends a little bit of time in G1 before moving on. So some things that happen in the G1 phase include the fact that the cell is metabolically active. This is going to mean that it's doing chemical reactions in the cytoplasm. These would include things like cellular respiration, making ATP, energy, producing proteins. Which organelle produces proteins? Remember, that's done by the ribosome. Which organelle does cellular respiration? That's done by the mitochondria. Okay, these are things that we should be linking our brain to. When you hear these words, you should say, oh, I know where that happens in the cell. Anyway, and then at the end of the G1 phase, we are going to duplicate the organelles. Okay, so we're going to go through, duplicate the organelles and get ready to start duplicating the DNA. So before we move on to the next phase, there's actually these things called checkpoints. Okay, so before we move on from the G1 phase, the cell has to go through a checkpoint. Okay, why do you think the cell needs to go through a checkpoint? Well, part of the reason is that we want to make sure that the cell is healthy, it's growing correctly, all the organelles are duplicated correctly, there's not any major issues going on inside the cell, because we don't want the cell to continue on through the cell cycle if it is not a healthy cell. So it's important that it goes through a checkpoint to make sure that everything is functioning normally, everything is healthy, before we move on to the next phase. The next phase in the cell's life is called the S phase, or the synthesis phase. And this is when our DNA is replicated. Okay, so you can see here in our little illustration that the S phase takes up a shorter amount of time than the G1 or G2 phase. Okay, so, but this is a very important step because we have to duplicate our DNA. Now, remember the word synthesis means to put parts together to equal the whole. So we're putting parts together to make a copy of the DNA. So you need to remember from this phase that the DNA is replicated in the nucleus. This is very, very, very important. Okay, you need to circle this, put a star by it. This is one of those things that I will ask you about again and expect you to know that the DNA is replicated during the S phase. Okay, so at this point, we are making a copy of our DNA. So now the cell goes from having 46 chromosomes, okay, times 2. A normal human cell has 46, okay, just in a normal cell. But once we duplicate the DNA, 46 times 2 means we now have 92 chromosomes in that cell. Okay, so just like before we moved on to our S phase, we go through another checkpoint before G2 phase. Okay, so we go through another checkpoint, and this checkpoint is especially important because during this checkpoint, we check to make sure the DNA is copied correctly. This is especially crucial. We want to make sure that when we copy the DNA, when we replicated that DNA, those chromosomes, that each of them were done without mistakes. Okay, because if we have mistakes in the DNA, those mistakes would be passed on to the next cell. And as that cell grows up and divides and then replicates, it would be passed on to the next cell. So it's very important that we make sure the DNA is correct before we allow the cell to move on to the G2 phase. All right, the G2 phase stands for growth 2 phase. This is our second period of growth after the DNA has been replicated. So at this point, we have twice the amount of DNA that our cell needs. So we have 2 of everything. This is to prepare for cell division. So during this phase, we are basically just making proteins and other molecules, and we are preparing for division. Okay, so the cell is getting ready to go through division, okay, which is a pretty big ordeal. And you guessed it, before we move on to the replicating phase, we have to, yet again, go through, okay, our last checkpoint. Last checkpoint here, okay, before division. So we have to make sure that the cell is healthy, everything was replicated correctly, everything is good, we're all set to go for division so that we make sure we have a healthy cell that's dividing. Okay, I want to stop here before we move on to the next step of the cell cycle and discuss what interphase means. So interphase is not a separate phase of cell cycle, but it's actually the G1S and G2 together. We call this interphase. Okay, so when the cell is in G1S or G2, we say the cell is an interphase. Okay, and this is a part of a cell's life where it spends most of its time. Okay, so during interphase, couple of characteristics. It's going to look normal. We can see a nucleus, and for the most of the time, the DNA is going to be arranged in chromatin. Remember, this is when the DNA is loosely organized, kind of like a bowl of spaghetti, as compared to where it's organized in the form of chromosomes later on when it divides. So if everything is all ready to go, then the cell is going to enter into M phase, or mitosis. Mitosis is what we're going to spend a good amount of time on, going over the different phases individually. So for now, I just want you to know that in mitosis, the nucleus is dividing. The nucleus is dividing, and then we'll be separated during cytokinesis. And so you can see here, it's the last step of the cell cycle, mitosis and cytokinesis. So mitosis is the division of the nucleus, and then the division of the cytoplasm is called cytokinesis. And then this is the last step of the cell cycle before the cell is completely divided into 2 cells. And like I said, we'll go over in detail all the steps of mitosis. All right, so this concludes our video lesson over the cell cycle. Make sure you have everything recorded down in your journal, and make sure you go back and rewatch any parts that you might have missed. And then you need to go ahead and get started on the next thing.